welcome to our first town hall for NYCGPA's Social Equity Committee. We're really excited to have you here, and we have an extra special guest today with us, Anthony Posada. He is a supervising attorney on the Community Justice Unit and also on the MRTA team. Hey, Anthony.
Hi, Carlos. Thanks for having me.
Of course, it's our pleasure. So tell us a little bit about your work. I'll give a brief introduction about some of the things you're currently doing, but I'd love to hear a little bit more from you. All right, Anthony Posada is the founder and art programmer of Project Attica, who works to educate the public on the status of mass incarceration through art-centered activities and projects. Project Attica specifically teaches students how to become an artivist by using art to express the social justice issues that they are passionate about. By building around the elements of social justice and solidarity, Project Attica creates room for our collective voices while establishing self-determination, dignity, and sustained peace. Prior experiences include work in deportation defense, immigration and criminal defense, landlord-tenant law, and more. Anthony is a graduate of City University of New York Law School, CUNY Law, Queens College, where he received his JD. And his bachelor's is from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Did I get it all, Anthony?
You did. Thank you, Carlos. So yeah, that forms the bulk of the work that I do kind of on the side when it comes to Project Attica. But the focus of my work and the reason I imagine I'm a panelist with you all here today is my background is in criminal defense. I was a public defender in Queens County before I became a staff attorney in the Community Justice Unit and then later on a supervisor. But while defending people in Queens County for misdemeanors and felonies, I got to live firsthand the experiences of the war on marijuana that was being waged here in New York City, which I can talk about more later throughout the panel. And it kind of formed the impetus for me to be more involved and have the Legal Aid Society, which is the largest public defender in the state and in the nation, to be a member of the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act to push forward and to be a part of the Start Smart campaign.
Excellent. And we'll come back to your project with Attica in a little bit, as we talk about what are some ways for people who want to get involved in this industry and how even anyone can do that, through art especially. All right. So Anthony, can you tell me a little bit more about who you consider to be formerly incarcerated and what they can do now to get involved in the cannabis business?
So, who do I consider to be formerly incarcerated?
Yes. So you can no longer be a part of the legacy market if you engage the lawful market, and the people who are looking to better themselves and their families, their livelihoods. How can those people who may have records, who may have had contact with the criminal justice system, been incarcerated, and they're now looking to this industry, how can they become involved with a criminal record?
Okay, so one of the very key provisions of the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act was the expungement provision, the automatic expungement, because it's the first of its kind. New York did not have an expungement on its laws, and to include it within the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act framework is essential to driving into reality the promise of making sure that this legislation would provide social equity, that it would repair, and that it would restore people. So the good thing about the way the expungement provision works is that it is automatic. People don't have to do anything, right? Before that, we had in New York a ceiling law. We still do, but that ceiling law, for people who have worked with it, they can see that it's very limiting. People who have had more than 2 convictions, whether it's misdemeanors or felonies, are ineligible to apply for ceiling. But here, under this section of the MRTA, people who previously had been convicted of marijuana possession and other charges related to marijuana would have those automatically expunged, and they would not be prevented from joining the industry, Carlos. Actually, they are the kinds of people that the legislation envisions to enter and have access into the industry, and in fact, to get priority for licensing into the industry. So again, that was another one of the pillars of the Marijuana Regulation Act. The MRTA, I'll just keep saying so that I don't have to keep repeating it, but it was to ensure that the same communities that were previously being subjected to the criminalization of marijuana, that they can actually have pathways, meaningful ones, to enter the industry. And I know that that was something that was fought really hard for into the legislation, because it's what really sets it apart from the ways in which marijuana has been legalized in other states. So people who were previously impacted by marijuana convictions can feel that they are the ones who are being invited and welcomed into the industry. We have to wait until the regulatory bodies are formed, until we have a fully established Cannabis Advisory Control Board, until we have the Office of Cannabis Management completely established as well, for people, so that we can actually start to see the language around the applications for licensing, where people who have been impacted can put that on their applications. And the good thing also is that the legislation set aside a percentage of the licenses to go to people that were impacted. So that's really important as well.
Excellent, excellent, precisely. The MRTA is for New Yorkers of color, New Yorkers disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, their communities, and it's meant to be a disruptor to end cyclical poverty. So we're not looking, the MRTA is not looking to assist massive corporations or adjacent industries like big tobacco, big alcohol. The purpose of the MRTA is to really develop communities that need the development. And with that said, Anthony, let's move on to our presentation for today. All right. Beautiful green fields. All right, so at the end, at NYCGPA, we are a big tent industry trade association, catch-all, working to ensure that the nascent cannabis industry develops into one that benefits New York State stakeholders, businesses specifically, and small and mid-scale operators more broadly. We represent growers, processors, retailers, and prospective license holders, sponsors, and other donors. We believe that the best outcomes are achieved when regulatory infrastructure producers shared equity for thousands of businesses, not just a handful of very big companies. All right, I'd like to thank everyone who helped make this event, this town hall possible. Samir, our chair, thank you so much for giving us a space to do this. Glenna helped with the presentation, brilliant presentation. John, Damien, Gail, Alexis, Hunter, Brian, Jasmine, Aswad, thank you guys for supporting New York Cannabis. We really appreciate it. So a little bit about NYCGPA. We are 150 total members and counting. 65% are licensed growers and processors, ranging from nurseries and growers to processors, genetics work, as well as our sponsors, partners, retailers, and donors. We are a launch pad for prospective THC cultivators, processors, distributors, laboratories, dispensaries, on-site consumption sites, and delivery services. All right, let's move on to the discussing a little bit more of the social equity components of the MRTA and what they were really based around. The legislators that advised the MRTA did not work in a vacuum. They had collaborators from a wide spectrum of fields in law and politics and nonprofit organizations, grassroots organizations that every day saw the impact of the war on drugs on New Yorkers and their families, their livelihoods, and want to disrupt that suffering, that poverty. Governor Andrew Cuomo signed the MRTA bill, which wasn't the only bill competing to be the bill for adult use cannabis. The other bill did not contain the necessary social equity components that needed to be a successful endeavor for the state. So on March 31st, Governor Cuomo legalizes adult use cannabis. The MRTA Act in New York State, the legislation creates the Office of Cannabis Management, known as OCM, governed by a Cannabis Control Board to oversee and implement the law. The OCM will issue licenses and develop regulations outlining how and when business can participate in the new industry. The Office of Cannabis Management will have an executive director working in conjunction with a chief equity officer and an advisory board. And Anthony, I think you know a little bit about how that is setting up to, what that is setting up to become, what values, what ethics, integrity are really important to have in the selection of this. Can you tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on this?
Yes, Carlos. And I actually want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier about making sure that the industry that is going to ultimately be established in New York is one that is representative and diverse of the communities that were previously impacted. Because when we were going around talking to different stakeholders and community members, many of them were actually pushing back and telling us, well, why would we support legislation that's just going to come and replicate what's happening in other states where the industry and the people behind the companies don't represent us. They're majority white, they're not people of color. So there was a lot of pushback around that. And so what I foresee and the understanding that is guiding this legislation is that the setup of these different bodies, from the OCME to the Cannabis Control Board and the Advisory Board, even though there's some picks from different electeds, both from the governor and from the Senate, right? The idea is that these will have to be people with lived experience, people with understanding, people with connections to communities that were suffering from the war on marijuana, which were primarily Black and Brown communities, right? Something I would point out at this point is that for many, many years, New York City was leading as the marijuana arrest capital of the world, right? So for decades, right, thousands and thousands of people were arrested for low-level marijuana possession. And so the understanding is that these bodies that are going to be in charge of sort of opening the gates to the industry and selecting who and what types of businesses is going to be one that will ensure that it's staying true to the spirit of the legislation, which is one that it's supposed to be about bringing equity back, restoring people, and repairing the harm that was done.
Absolutely, absolutely. What are some of the things that the social equity community can do now in order to organize, to get their voices heard, to ensure that upcoming regulations do not negatively impact their outlook in this industry?
Well, I have known and have been speaking with groups that, for example, before Governor Cuomo's resignation, there was a name that had been floated to potentially be in an executive position in the Office of Cannabis Management, possibly to be the director of it. And the groups immediately started to assemble, and they were planning to hold a rally and inviting other people as well to be a part of it, to stand completely against the person that was going to be named, to make sure that they were making a public showing that this is not something that they were okay with. The person did not have a connection to being in that role, and was one that was really more precisely just somebody that the governor happened to know and that he wanted to see in that role. And so even though luckily as the session ended, this person did not end up being named there. And then, as we all know, with the governor's resignation, a lot of these filling of these positions have come to a pause temporarily. But a lot of the groups have been sharing information, doing what we're doing right now in this town hall about informing people what these provisions are supposed to look like, what the MRTA is supposed to do, which bodies are in charge of issuing the licenses, how people can access the industry. So those are some of the things, Carlos, that I've seen groups already doing, which is just being informed, getting involved, and organizing to take action to make sure that the people who go into these important positions are ones that are going to be mindful and going to be leading positively to make changes. As you're saying, you know, the word that's sticking out from what you've been saying is like to disrupt what's been going on.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, let's move on back to our presentation. Next slide, please. All right, well, hopefully you're seeing a slide. I think right now we can transition to speaking about the different categories of business licenses that the MRTA legislated into being. We can begin with how exactly will these licenses that provide the specific language for creating advantages for social equity applicants, how will that be executed? And that's what we're in the process of now. Anthony touched on a little bit about the organization that happened under Governor Cuomo. We're seeing the transition of a new governor, Governor Kathy Hochul, our first female governor. Today is International, hold on. Today is Women's Equality Day. Thank you, Glenna, for letting us know. That's very important. And in the spirit of that, we are very hopeful that Governor Hochul will continue to advocate for social equity applicants in the formation of her regulations. Perfect. I think we should have the slides there now. All right. So what is the social equity language in the MRTA bill? Well, the board, in consultation with the chief equity officer and executive director, and after receiving public input, known as the public comment period, shall create and implement a social and economic equity plan and actively promote applicants from communities disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition. Emphasis on that. And promote racial, ethnic, and gender diversity when issuing licenses for adult use cannabis related activities, including mentoring potential applicants by prioritizing consideration of applications by applicants who are from communities disproportionately impacted by the enforcement of cannabis prohibition or qualify as minority or service disabled veterans. Anthony, how do you think these kind of qualifiers can be best executed by legislators?
Yes. So for them to actively promote applicants from communities that have been disproportionately impacted, a lot of this is also, Carlos, going to come down to what the actual language in the application looks like, to some extent, right? But also to fully live up to this social equity language, there has to be also a component in here about reaching out to communities to make sure that they are being fully informed. A lot of people that were part of the Start Smart campaign pushing for the Marijuana Regulation Act want to start to host gatherings. They want to start to host know your rights sessions. They want to start putting together clinics where people can know the ins and outs of how to navigate the industry. And so legislators, like the legislators, would be in a best position of living up to this language of social equity by actually connecting with those groups, by actually making sure that they're in touch with them and constantly receiving feedback from them. I know that both Senator Liz Kruger and Assemblywoman Crystal Peoples-Stokes were constantly in communication with impacted groups, with people who were disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition, constantly in communication from women-owned businesses, by farmers. And that constant feedback loop is what brought about this very, very sort of gold standard legislation. And so to me, Carlos, that's the best way I can see that these qualifiers can actually be manifested into reality, is by making sure that people have as much at their disposal to make these informed decisions, and so that they don't feel like they're being left out in the process. I don't know if that fully answers your question, Carlos, or if you were wanting to get at, but those are just some thoughts that I have.
No, it definitely answered my question, and that's why we're here today, to continue providing a forum for people to discuss their questions, comments, and concerns. And yeah, I encourage everyone in the audience right now to please ask your questions. If you'd like to ask anonymously, I believe you are able to do that. So don't be afraid. Please chime in whenever you want. This can be very dry. This can be very boring. But it's ultimately for the benefit of people of color. If you are Black, if you're Latino, if you're a woman and you're listening in right now and you have a question and you have ideas, like, please voice them here, because this forum is for you. All right, let's move on to the next slide. All right, so there are different social equity categories that we have already touched on. Some of them, Anthony's specialty is in individuals from communities disproportionately impacted by the enforcement of cannabis prohibition. There are also the category of minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, minority and women-owned businesses, distressed farmers, and service-disabled veterans. So there's quite a diverse array of categories that people can apply as, and it's meant to be as inclusive as possible. All right, so the social and economic equity plan shall require the consideration of additional criteria in its licensing determinations. That is still to be determined, so we don't have a lot of answers about that. Just be aware that this is the target audience that legislators are planning for and creating the outstanding regulatory structures for. So again, if you are a member of a community disproportionately impacted by the enforcement of cannabis prohibition, this is the legislation for you to really be watching out for, the regulations that you need to be tuned into, because this can be very decisive. You know, this cyclical poverty, you know, is something that this bill is tackling. And if you're looking around your community and you're not seeing the business leaders that you need to see, the people in the commercials for advertising other businesses do not look like you, then this is probably for you. And we encourage everyone in the audience today to please ask your questions and be a part of the dialogue this evening. And we're also looking at potential income requirements. You should have an income lower than 80% of the median income of the county in which you reside in. And there's also another category if you were convicted for a marijuana-related offense prior to the effective date of this chapter when it was written, or had a parent, guardian, child, spouse, or dependent, or an individual who prior to the effective date of this chapter was convicted of a marijuana-related offense. Again, this is a legislation that is inclusive of you and your family. We're looking to, really support these individuals who have been marginalized, who have had contact with law enforcement, and this is meant to correct that, make reparations, if you will. All right, next slide. All right, license types. Like we were talking before, this legislation has been in design for a very long time, and we really wanted a novel approach unmatched by any other state in terms of social equity. And that's why very early on, vertical integration was not a part of what we're looking at now. So if you look on the very left, you'll see registered organizations. Think medical providers. They will have full vertical integration, meaning that from seed to sale, they are overseeing the entire supply chain. That obviously comes with its advantages. Monopolization is something that comes to mind. And this MRTA wanted to avoid that and really support every different people at every stage of the supply chain and be as inclusive as possible of different and diverse businesses, ancillary businesses, businesses not directly doing plant touching. There is ample opportunity at every stage of the supply chain for you to become involved should you want to. And that's where you voice your concerns if that is not being met yet for you. Micro businesses are allowed to be vertically integrated, but with serious limitations on the scope and size of their operations. And then you have the supply chain that we will be focusing on right now, and that is we are looking at a non-vertically integrated supply chain. At the very beginning, we have the nursery, cultivator, distributor, kind of grower aspect with processor on the side. You can have some of these licenses together, but this is the first half that needs to stay together. You cannot have an interest in a dispensary, for example, or on-site consumption because vertical integration is not allowed. Anthony, do you have any thoughts about the supply chain? It's a very interesting supply chain approach they took, and if you would like to share your thoughts on it, now is a great time.
Thank you, Carlos. Before I actually give my thoughts about this supply chain structure, I would just want to go back to what you were talking in your previous slide about the social equity plan, because when you had asked me earlier about, right, how can legislators actually live up to the qualifiers in the social equity language, right? And so, yes, even though we don't have right now the actual language of what it's going to look like for people to prove either, right, A or any other section for that matter, there's ample evidence and so many reports that have been penned and published about where marijuana enforcement was concentrated all throughout the state. And right, time and time again, it's proven that it was really concentrated in communities of color. And so, right, I can point to a few neighborhoods here in New York, like Brownsville, sections of the South Bronx, certain sections in Harlem, where the numbers for marijuana arrests, marijuana convictions were incredibly high. And so for people who were previously impacted by this, right, there's going to be so many different ways for them to be able to establish that they should be given a priority based on they live in this particular neighborhood, they were impacted by it themselves or their family was. And so just wanted to quickly add that to the conversation. But to go to the licensing structure, it was incredibly important to ensure that MRTA did not have vertical integration, right? And because the vertical integration, I guess a lot of us in the group and the coalition for that matter, were learning from the experiences of the medical marijuana program that had been established in New York. And in that regard, right, for people that know, it's like only a certain number of players were allowed into that space. I don't know if the numbers have changed, but we knew like up to 5 people dominated that space. I mean, 5 companies dominated that space, and that really didn't allow for any diversity, and it really just allowed for what people were telling us were afraid were going to happen, which is like, look, this is going to come in and it's going to be dominated by big marijuana, or like almost like big tobacco or alcohol, and the same thing is going to happen here, where we were going to push out the people who you're professing to be helping out, or who you're talking about restoring and repairing. And so the good thing about, right, these arrows moving in different directions and not having vertical integration is, as you were mentioning, Carlos, that it allows for the opportunity for people to access the industry in a multiple ways, in a multitude of ways. And to prevent that sort of from top down control by just one player.
Precisely. multi-state operators have been heavily criticized by individuals who are part of the Social Equity Committee as being antithetical to our goals. So tell me, let's go back to Project Attica. If you're an artist and you find yourself, hey, I was part of the legacy market, I'd like to, I've been out for a couple of years now, I've worked really hard, and I want to get involved, can their art, where can their art be used, for example?
In so many different ways. There's a concept that we use called artivism, which is putting together art and activism. And so we could have their art be displayed where they can make shirts with messages, where they can make tote bags with messages, where they can have their messages showing up on social media. There's just so many different spaces in gatherings like this town hall, let's say, but let's say if it were to be moved to an in-person event that I've heard of, some that have already been happening, where they can be going out and showing their art in spaces where people are talking and gathering for what is going to be of New York's legalization and full sale of cannabis soon to come in 2022. We're hoping to see, and so those artists can be using so many different mediums at the same time, Carlos, to get their message out and to promote other people, because that's one thing that we see with the power of art is that it reaches out and it crosses so many dimensions, and you don't necessarily have to even be speaking the same language, but the art itself will convey that message. And so that's just to say that, if there are artists who eventually listen to this webinar or this recording, that they should be encouraged to start promoting their art and getting their message out. If their message is about cannabis and cannabis legalization and New York's market, that they should be encouraged to do so.
Absolutely. I can't think of a better industry where art from Project Attica, from other organizations that are very heavily involved in art behind bars, will be able to find jobs as artists. Packaging needs to be designed. Web design needs to be done. And these are skills that are very accessible and can be taught if you do not have those skills, but you're nonetheless, if you have the interest, motivation, and drive, you should pursue all employment at all these tiers with your skills. There's definitely room for everyone to participate in. All right, let's see the next slide. All right, incubator program, very important. An incubator program will be created to encourage social and economic equity applicants to apply. And if granted an adult use cannabis license, permit, registration, the program will provide direct support in the form of counseling services, education, small business coaching, and financial planning and compliance assistance. Now, Anthony, what should this look like to you?
It should look like the people that we've been talking about, Carlos. It should look like people from the legacy market, people who previously impacted, people who here have not run a business before, let's say, or if there's so many people who fall on the spectrum of the legacy market, right? There are people who for a while were putting bread on their table and making sure that their families were being fed by selling marijuana in an illicit way. And so this should be a space for them to transfer all the skills that they already have when it comes to businesses to doing it in a space where they can get the actual support and get the actual financial planning, especially if ultimately some of the applications, again, not knowing what they're actually going to look like, are going to require some of that. Like, oh, before we grant you a license, we want to see that you can actually know how a business is run and be in compliance and know about all the different regulations that will apply. So to me, an incubator program that is going to live up to the social equity components of MRTA should look like the same people that the bill is looking to restore, repair, and to fully bring back into a space where it's now lawful to sell it. And so it should be people from the legacy market, formerly incarcerated people, formerly people criminalized by marijuana prohibition and their communities.
Absolutely. One of the words that's used in the MRTA is the word privilege, and that getting to be a part of this lawful market is a privilege. And I think that should definitely be a part of the education that social equity applicants receive, because it is a privilege to be a part of this industry. And we have our legislators, communities, advocates like you to thank for making this all possible. And whoever is able to participate in the incubator program will be very lucky, and they will definitely receive, I believe, the support they need to. But now is the time to us to provide feedback as to what that should look like. And that is really critical. So if anyone has any ideas or questions about the incubator program, things that you think should be a part of, things that you're concerned about, please voice your comments in, down below in the chat box. All right, next slide. And I think that's it for the slides. So thank you, everyone. Now is the time when we will open up the floor for discussion. Please feel free to ask Anthony questions. He's a tremendous resource. I cannot stress that enough. And you can ask me questions as well. We will try to answer your questions. Like we said before, there is outstanding regulatory framework that we are still waiting on. So while we don't have definite answers, we do know somewhat where they're generally headed. We can inform and educate you appropriately. Okay. So there's a question here that says whether or not the incubator program will precede the initial round of licenses. Did I get that right? What do you think, Anthony?
So I think it should precede the initial round of licenses. I know that something else that was a big sticking point for coalition members was having startup capital from day one. Because, right, and even though there are provisions in the bill that say that social equity applicants will be given assistance, or even people from minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses to get loans and special loans. And these are what the Office of Cannabis Management and the Cannabis Control Board are supposed to help people do. To me, it would make sense. It would make sense to start helping people get into the incubator program. But at the same time, if they can get into the incubator program while also not fearing that they will not be able to access a license down the line, that shouldn't be the case, right? That they shouldn't be determined on that. Like if they're in the incubator program, I think the understanding should be that they will have a license that they can sort of build on versus getting into the incubator program and realizing that like now there are no more licenses. I don't think it would work out that way. I don't think legislators would work towards that end.
Absolutely. And someone asked, do we think this will be available across the state? I believe so. I think Majority Leader People Stokes, and I think of the area where she's from. And I know that that is definitely something that is on their mind as a priority. This legislation is inclusive of all of New York, not just places that may come up to mind like Brooklyn or Manhattan or Queens. There is definitely a lot of excitement to see what is coming out for upstate New York as well. Are there certain banks that are open to working with potential cannabis businesses? That is a great question. Slightly complicated, but we will try and answer that. Anthony, do you want to go ahead?
Carlos, I'm actually not too well versed on that, so I would defer to you.
Sure, of course. Right now, historically, banks have levied enormous fees to bank your cannabis business with them. That is because the cannabis is still an illicit substance federally, and that creates problems for tax purposes. You currently don't have many of the privileges other businesses do when it comes to tax season. And that is definitely an issue area where you can have a lot of say in once you begin learning that no, banks are not going to cater competitively to cannabis businesses, and that you do probably need to have a plan to surmount that challenge. You are looking at businesses that have banked with like cash, and their system is entirely all cash because they are excluded from the traditional banking system. I do believe that that is a federal priority to address that now that we're seeing all the states coming in. At least from New York State, we have introduced legislation that would address that banking issue. Currently, it is TBD, very much so. Yeah.
Carlos?
Yes.
I just wanted to let you know that Jason Held, one of our NYCGPA members, he's affiliated with the National Credit Union Administration, has been working on some research into credit unions and THC licensure in New York State. Currently, the only credit union that we're aware of that will be working with THC businesses is State Employees Federal Credit Union. But likely once the regulations come out and banks are able to really sort things out, you'll see certainly more credit unions and possibly some other banking institutions jumping into the mix. I just wanted to add that.
Absolutely. So always be on the lookout for people who are open to assisted cannabis businesses. There are some, and the list is growing, especially now at this critical stage in the MRTA. Are there any more questions that I think I do see more questions. All right. New Jersey just finalized the rules this week. It sounds like it may be easy to get a micro license there. Do you see any complications with New York applicants who might have a New Jersey license? And the answer is yes. Right now, this process is only for New Yorkers. Unfortunately, you can have any other interests in another state. Your application will not receive the priority that other applications receive. And yeah, it's this type of joint interest will likely not be allowed. Anthony, do you have anything to add?
No, you're absolutely right, Carlos. I definitely also foresee complications and something like that happening, right? For the very same reasons that people were saying, well, how is cannabis legalization going to be any different than these bigger industries where bigger players come in and dominate, right? And so I've already heard of people who have businesses in Colorado, trying to stake out a claim in New Jersey, right? And so it's just like saying it's the reason why we would be giving priority to New Yorkers and to people who were impacted by marijuana prohibition.
Precisely. And one question here from Leslie: has there been any indication of how much these licenses are going to cost? And the answer is technically no, but if you look at the medical licensing costs, they are pretty large, substantial numbers. The first half of the supply chain in the non-vertically integrated supply chain is the most capital and resource heavy. I believe that dispensaries will be least capital heavy. So those might be more accessible to certain applicants. But yes, the costs, you will have to bear the cost because ultimately the fees will go toward propping up the agencies that were created as part of the MRTA, for sure. Anything to add, Anthony?
No, not so much about the fees associated with licenses, but just to give like some more of the bullet points that I'm a little bit more familiar with when it comes to the criminal side of the legalization that it changed. One huge thing that MIRTA also does is that it addresses the collateral consequences in fields of immigration, housing, employment, child welfare, and other consequences that were associated with marijuana criminalization. Are another big portion of the social equity of the law. And that, I don't think we've touched on this yet, but right, this legislation is also so groundbreaking in that it specifically assigned 40% of marijuana tax revenue to go into reinvestment of communities that were disproportionately impacted by the drug war, another 40% for schools and public education, and 20% to drug treatment, prevention, and education. And so that was very key and something that was fought all the way to the end, to the actual finish line.
Precisely, and these public coffers are very important, and they are the source of impact for this legislation. That is how change will come about at reducing adverse childhood experiences for New Yorkers of color, young New Yorkers of color. That is how we're going to help reduce addiction, and that is how we're going to help people who have faced mass incarceration re-enter their communities, the job market, and better themselves and their families. And that is a focus of this legislation, is where the tax money will go. So you can expect pretty high capital burdens, if you will. We have more questions in the Q&A box. Do you believe seed funding will be part of an incubator program? Really interesting question. Do you believe seed funding should or will be part of an incubator program? What do you think, Anthony?
Seed funding, like the capital, right? Startup capital, like having access to money so that you can get right into it.
I believe so.
Yeah, look, right. I haven't seen the language for that, but I would believe that it should be part of an incubator program, so you can get up and running in that program, or else it's just a dream on a paper without having an actual means or mechanisms to actually put it into action.
Absolutely, especially probably some of those earlier licenses, their money will be really important to ensuring that other people can get licenses too. And that money will help get things off the ground. It might be, it might not. Again, those answers, we will have to wait and see. Truly, it could go either way at this point. But I do believe there will be some financing available to applicants, some sort, in some way. The next question is, who qualifies as a distressed farmer? Any idea how the distressed farmers became their own social equity class? And who is their legislative champion? Wow, colorful question right there. Anthony, do you know what a distressed farmer is?
Carlos, I don't have the definition for a distressed farmer.
Distressed farmers are farmers who have typically been excluded. So we're looking at Black farmers, looking at Latino farmers, we're looking at women farmers.
Can I jump in on this one?
Hi, Samir. Samir is the head of NYCGPA Social Equity Committee. How are you, Samir? Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, you're doing a great job, Carlos. As a farmer myself, I can answer this one. So I don't have the MRTA directly in front of me. There is a provision that speaks exactly to distressed farmer in the MRTA, and it does pertain to, there are some financial qualifiers there. The distressed farmer category was something that the NYCGPA fought very hard for. The NYCGPA, starting out as a cannabis grower and processors association, obviously working with farmers, we understood that there was a need to give farmers specifically an opportunity to get into the cannabis industry. If we want this industry to serve all of New York, then what we want is New York farmers to have an opportunity to get into this industry, have a leg up, so that they can continue to operate their farms that for many people have been, been in their families for a long time. So the NYCGPA definitely was instrumental in getting the distressed farmer. And the idea, again, is to make sure that New York State farmers, not just like we're talking about, not the big players, not the multi-state operators, but that New York State farmers, especially ones that have been adversely affected by the dairy industry or just traditional farming, whatever it may be, have an opportunity. So that was something that was put in there. And the whole idea, if you look at the social equity component of the MRTA, is that it's not just obviously people of color. I mean, I'm a Dominican guy from Queens, so I get it. You got communities adversely affected, but it's about actual like equitable industry. So, women, business owners, distressed farmers, disabled veterans, those are also categories in the social equity law, so that it is equitable. And obviously people of color, obviously the communities that have been completely obliterated by the war on drugs since the 80s, especially getting opportunity. So, that's just another example of why the NYCGPA got behind this law, other than the other law that was floating around, because this provides an actual opportunity for an equitable industry, and not just to some categories here, but as many categories as possible.
For sure. And their legislative champion, Samir, who is that? The second part of the question, who is their legislative champion?
I know Donna Lapardo, I'm not very much into the politics side of things, but I know Donna Lapardo has been from the very beginning, been, instrumental in getting, in helping hemp farmers. Maybe Dan would know a little bit more about who's been championing, but I know Donna Lapardo, is it Assemblywoman or Senator Lapardo, has been really helpful for the farmers.
Assemblywoman Donna Lapardo.
Yeah.
Yes, precisely. I think everyone should be a legislative champion for farmers. That's absolutely a given. Absolutely. All right. Are there social impact lenders that you are aware of that are willing to support entrepreneurs in the cannabis space? Oh, we just briefly touched on this. Dan did. Samir, Dan, if you guys want to chime in right now, you guys might know a little bit more about these people who are working right now actively with the cannabis community.
Sorry, what question are we looking at?
Wheelhouse.
Alexis Mena's question, are there social impact lenders that you are aware of that are willing to support entrepreneurs in the cannabis space?
I've been hearing talk about that. I don't know anyone concretely, but I've heard a couple of organizations that are kind of looking into that, but I don't have anyone specifically that I can confirm at this point.
We will keep that question in mind for our next event. That is definitely a great question. We are also learning as we go, and hopefully each meeting we will have more and more concrete information to inform and educate you. All right, the next question is, will the regulations and licensing for ancillary services like laboratory analysis become available at the same time as the grower, processor, retail licenses? Well, laboratory testing is a fundamental part of the seed to sale process. It helps prevent things like diversion, for example. We didn't really talk about diversion here yet, but I would believe that it is laboratories are definitely a priority, especially addressing the bottleneck that currently exists in laboratory testing. I know that has been discussed as being a definite issue to focus on very soon. Would anyone else like to add anything more? Samir, Dan?
You did a fantastic job, and thanks to Anthony for being our resident expert tonight. This was great.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks so much for being on board. There was some really good information. I definitely learned a few things tonight, so that was good.
For sure. Thank you, Anthony, for being with us today. You did an incredible job. I know you're incredibly busy with your clients at Legal Aid Society. So we really thank you for being here today. You didn't have to be, but you did. So it says a lot about you and what you stand for. Thank you again, Anthony.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you to NYCGPA for all the work that you all are doing, for everything you've done. I know that you all are, I just learned being instrumental in also pushing for this legislation and making sure that farmers and all people who who are looking to be a part of the industry can also be a part of it. And thank you for hosting this town hall, because I know this is the kind of events and activities that should be happening right now as we gear up to see what these regulatory bodies are going to look like, and as people start to actually start applying for the industry. And so thank you for hosting this event.
Absolutely. We'll just keep getting better and better with time. All right, everyone. Have a good evening.
Good evening all.
Good night.